Citizen 12 is brought to you by Complexify, a social purpose corporation founded to support you living in alignment with your conscience and discerning what that is. Find out more at complexify.org. complexiphy.org.
Hello, citizens. My name is Paige Hulsey.
And my name is Emily Bogen.
And this is episode 15 of the Citizen 12 podcast. Citizen 12 is not a program or health treatment, but an inclusive place, common ground to share and learn. If you have not yet listened to episode 0, we invite you to do that. You'll get a good sense of what this show is about and hear our steps, which were inspired by Alcoholics Anonymous. And those can also be found through any of our sites. Just a note about listening to episode 0. I have been made aware that that isn't available through all platforms. I'm not quite sure why. I think it has something to do with that Spotify didn't pick us up and some other podcast services didn't pick us up until later in our airing. So for those of you who are listening through a platform that doesn't have, I believe it's episode 0 or the pre-launch, pre-episode 1 to maybe even episode 3, you can always go to C12Pod.com and listen to them straight from the site or investigate other platforms where they are still available.
A little more of a preface. This content may stir stuff up for you. In some ways, that's part of the point, but also we want to acknowledge that this can be hard, uncomfortable, and even disruptive. Please engage with us responsibly, and don't be on your own with stuff. Be in touch. If that's the right thing, we want that. We care about you. It's why we're making this show.
Our podcast is created in Seattle, Washington. We acknowledge this as Duwamish land and strive to honor the past, present, and future Indigenous lives here. Citizen 12 supports Duwamish tribal services by paying real rent. Find out more at realrentduwamish.org. Today's episode is the first in what will be a sort of series on injurious behaviors, and we're starting with lying. Today, in our first segment of this series, and I said sort of series because we aren't going to just go through and do episode after episode on injurious behaviors, but occasionally we will intersperse an episode on injurious behaviors into our regularly scheduled shows. But our first segment, we're going to start today talking just generally about injurious behaviors as a concept and kind of talk a little bit about like them versus character defects, which of course is mostly likely how many of us have heard about or thought about this area of spiritual work addressed before. And then in our second segment, we'll talk about today's injurious behavior, lying. And for this series, we plan to include pitfalls and traps related to the behavior in the main episode rather than doing a separate follow-up show. Part 1. What the hell are we even talking about with this injurious behavior stuff? First, let's talk about the terminology. When I wrote these steps and I examined the spirit of the work that I have experienced and seen done in 6 and 7, basically, which in the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, they're referred to as character defects and shortcomings. But what I really have observed and had experience with is addressing what I see as injurious behaviors is really at the heart of that. And that language about character defects is very would you say it's not that it's disorienting, but it just doesn't seem to quite accurately describe what we are actually talking about.
I would say absolutely. I agree.
And that it's, so it's like unnecessarily problematic, which a lot of this, I mean, as we've said again and again, a lot of words around spiritual stuff seems unnecessarily problematic. And that part of our aim here is to make more space to get the goods out of the content, making space for words to kind of be crappy and two-dimensional, as they are. Mm-hmm. Really the core of why I like examining the behavior rather than looking at it as though it's a character defect is related to a lot of evidence that's emerged about how disempowering it is to embody like an assumption about who we are as defective. I think a lot of us kind of intuitively get that feels wrong, but a lot of material in the world still kind of talks about like that who you are is bad or who you are is dishonest, and that really that's just not that useful. That dealing with what we've done and being even accurate about the tense we use, so not saying I am dishonest or I am lying, I mean I guess unless I am currently, but saying I have lied. It might seem like a small difference, but for a lot of us, it really hasn't felt right or seemed good. And the evidence is that it's not really useful to keep kind of projecting out into the future that who I am is dishonest, if the reality is that I have in the past I have told lies, which is a different thing.
Absolutely. I think the separating yourself from like yourself, your authentic self, from behaviors that you
identity,
have done,
maintaining the identity.
Really important.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, yeah. I think the implications of not doing that, of lumping yourself in with your behavior, I mean, you can just observe it, like what kind of harm that does when someone embodies mistakes that they have made. It really makes it harder to overcome, to try to change, etc. So I'm super for what you're proposing here.
We thought it'd be good also to identify. Well, actually, let me do an acknowledgement of today's show. I'm going to confess I feel less confident in the way that this show was planned. These topics that we're talking about today seem even more interrelated than usual, and having to discuss them in some sort of linear way, it's a little crazy making for me. It just seems like at every point I'm like, oh, but you need this information before we talk about this. Oh, but you need this information to talk about this. And we as always, we just have to start somewhere. Next, it seemed good to share part of what we see that motivates injurious behaviors. So again, talking about character defects, it's like, well, I mean, the way I relate to it, it's like, well, then that's just how I am. Dishonesty and lying is the topic of today's show, so I'm probably just going to keep coming back to that as an example. But if who I am is dishonest, it's like, how important is it even to, I mean, I guess it's okay to identify it, but it just doesn't seem like that useful. But talking about injurious behaviors, I think it's easier to start to address what motivates those injurious behaviors. And that's really important and critical for movement or having something else. So this is not going to be news to you, certainly, Emily, and I think to a lot of our listeners, that what we have seen and experienced that is underlying a lot of injurious behaviors and a lot of behaviors, period, is fear. This is not news to you.
It's not news.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder, always.
It's a good reminder. And if this does seem like news, or if you're a listener who is still like, oh no, I'm not afraid, I don't have much fear. If you're like a lot of us, it may just be that the way we thought of fear wasn't totally the whole picture, and that learning more about how fear can animate us or motivate us allowed us to see ways that we had been acting out of fear that we couldn't see before. for the rest of you who are already on board with that, yes, fear is this motivating force, maybe even pervasive. It's understandable. We know that fear, we have walked around with these very frequently arising fears. And a thing maybe I haven't said about this is how I really relate to these powerful forces like fear as warping. I think identifying that things are warping can be useful in understanding and giving kind of having compassion about it. Fear's useful. Fear's critical. We actually need it for learning and living. And like outsized fear is what I'm talking about that's warping. And I think it can be really it has been useful to me to be able to identify where disproportionate fear has then warped things that come after it. Mm. And I think about this kind of sequence of that the underlying thing is that I have a fear. And of course there are, I don't know if we're born and we have fear. It does seem like things happen and then fear arises. And yes, there's plenty of space to look at, well, what are the circumstances under which these fears start to arise? I don't think that's like off the table for discussion. It's just not what we're going to talk about today. But we have fears arise, and then because it's warping, my experience is that I then do be a different way because of the fear. So the example that I'm using is, as I've shared in the show before, that I've had this frequently arising fear that I don't matter. And then out of that fear, to kind of compensate or deal with that I am afraid that I don't matter, I be a couple of different ways, like in response. For one, I be self-centered. I be having my attention on myself. So I'm assessing, so I can be assessing, do I matter? Do I matter now? Is this better? And I also be vain. And I be, image conscious, which includes being controlling, right? Or I guess I'm telling you, and it includes being controlling. So that's what naturally comes out of how I'm being is doing different stuff, right? So it's not just that I have this fear that I don't matter and then nothing ever comes of it. The whole problem here is that I'm afraid of not mattering, and then I be these things that my conscience isn't asking me to be. My conscience isn't asking me to be vain or self-centered. And then it doesn't even stop there. It then goes on into what I do and how I interact with people that I am controlling or managing of my identity or my reputation, how I'm seen, my image. And that includes lying and being dishonest. But lying is really the thing I want to talk about. So this trajectory of being afraid, then being some kind of maybe even what we think of as character defective way of being. And then the behavior, though, the injurious behavior, the lying.
So let me get this straight. I'm afraid that I don't matter. And so then I become really focused on myself, and I become, focused on evaluating whether or not I do, and looking at cues to decipher that. And
like evidence gathering.
I'm constantly looking for evidence for my mattering.
Or not, yeah.
Or not.
That I do or not.
Yes. Well, we know actually that now that when we don't think we matter, we're actually more prone to looking for how we don't matter.
Right. Confirmation bias, that we gather evidence to support what we already suspect.
Yes. And vain, yes. So image conscience, very similar to that. And then I start to tell stories, or I lie to sort of fabricate mattering, on many different levels. I lie to myself. I lie to other people.
You're reporting this like you as from first person.
Mm-hmm.
Is that because you also relate?
Oh,
It's
yeah.
not that I've told my personal story and you're like trying it on, but you can
No.
actually see that you also have similar.
Yes, I absolutely do. I'm sort of trying on this structure, and yes, it absolutely checks out for me.
Okay.
Check.
Same.
Yep.
Yeah.
Me.
And
Sounds like me.
From what I can tell, this is very shared. I don't even really know if I know or interact with people who can't relate to this, even if that's easy or not to identify.
Or they aren't willing to see this.
Yeah,
which
totally.
I think is probably way more common.
Right, a lot of us don't want to engage in seeing this stuff for ourselves, but it looks to me like this is kind of there for most of us.
And I'm pretty sure our listeners are like-minded in the way that we do see these things in ourselves. So.
And that we want to be kind of digging in to see what is going on in here.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I want to talk about right here is when fear isn't quite fear. And we actually, funnily enough, had this come up right before we started recording today. You were kind of reporting that you were afraid, and I was saying it sounded actually more like good, healthy concern, and that we, especially for those of us who are in a practice of identifying unhealthy fear, that there may be this risk of accidentally putting too many things in that basket that doesn't make space for healthy concern or desire. So the example that I had used, so similar to being afraid that I don't matter, and it might take a moment for this to kind of make sense, but would be like a healthy desire for wanting to be appreciated. Wanting to be appreciated in a healthy, right-sized way isn't going to be warping the way that a fear, especially an undistinguished fear of not mattering, is going to be warping. And I really see that part of the clue about which is how attached we are, like the degree of attachment. Like if I just have some kind of lightly attached desire to be appreciated, which I definitely do, if something's interfering with being appreciated, it's not going to torque me and my behavior the way that a fear would, a warping fear. Being attached so much to something that I'm ready to do harmful stuff to you or me to try to get it, obviously that's problematic. But I also really see a risk in killing off those healthy desires. That doesn't work. That's not going to work. That doesn't work for a good, healthy, full-rounded life.
Right. I see the pendulum again here coming into play. You know, like I'm either behaving from a warped fear that I don't matter, or I am acting and pretending that there is no fear of not mattering and sort of like squashing it. And
maybe even pretending you're detached.
Yeah.
So that maybe lightly attached is somewhere between the very severe warping fear and I think it would be pretending to be detached. None of us are going to actually probably fully detach from an interest in being appreciated or mattering.
Right. So yeah, somewhere in the middle would be like, I would like it to be reflected back to me that I am a valuable human being, because I am a valuable human being.
Yeah,
And
like in a right-sized, healthy, lightly attached way. I like this.
I think we're onto something.
I thought we'd add that this way of things going, being afraid, then being some kind of defective way. And I'm going to say that being vain is sort of defective. I don't think it's character still, but I haven't found that being vain is I mean, maybe there's some healthy end of being vain, but then that wouldn't be being vain, right? That would be like taking good care of ourselves or something. So I think the extreme that we would call vain is kind of categorically not helpful or useful.
Mm-hmm.
I'm at peace with that anyway.
Right.
But I wanted to say that these, what I can tell is that these are just habits. This isn't the way it always has to be. It doesn't have to be that the second a fear arises, we're immediately thrown into being some weird way and then doing weird behavior out of it. I have definitely had relief from that cycle.
Mm-hmm.
It's not stuck. And,
Right.
and, you know, this might seem kind of controversial, but from what I can tell, I actually have access to all ways of being all the time. I have been all kinds of ways at different moments and points in my life. I mean, and I think I can only be a way in a moment, right? I've been panicked in moments. I'm not always panicked. That's not who I am, but I have access to being panicked. Same with gentle. I'm not always gentle, but I have access to being panicked and gentle, maybe even all the time. For me, this is part of the making space for an empowering way to interact with myself around my behavior, and seeing myself as more than just a collection of how I've been or what I've done in terms of who I am.
I would want to say, though, that I think when it comes to trauma, that and having, accumulated experiences of trauma, it can be more complicated to work through this stuff. And so I would say that if that's coming up for people, because that's kind of been the case for me, I think addressing trauma and trauma symptoms was important before kind of being able to get into the arena of perhaps, feeling fear and then having access to being, a variety of ways. I think when trauma is in the picture, fear can come up and it seems less of a choice to act in a certain way. And if that's the case, if it feels as if there is less of a choice, I would say maybe trauma is present.
Thank you for adding that. I agree. And I actually think there are things that pose barriers to freely being all kinds of ways, even other than trauma.
Right, absolutely.
And I guess I don't think I said, but I can hear how it might have been heard in there, that it's easy, or that in any moment we easily have access to any way of being. Nope, not at all my experience or what I'm saying. Yes, so I definitely want to acknowledge if it doesn't feel like we have access to a new way of being, that's totally valid. And that there might be stuff to unclog. And I guess I'm of the mind that some of that might be traumatic stuff and some of it just might be other stuff. Yeah. So I definitely agree and have space for that. And I appreciate you making sure that we have included that. This is not easy stuff. And it's still available. Even though it's not easy, it's still available.
And if it feels less available one day, I mean, in my experience, it can feel more available later that afternoon or the next day. I've been driven to lie because of fear, and then, later that afternoon come to see like the harm that I have caused and, get
perspective, get turned around.
Yeah, get turned around in that same day. And then,
same.
So, yeah.
Same. And yeah, I guess in case it's important, we're not talking about, this fear of not mattering. This is not about an immediate threat fear or a tangible fear. I'm talking about a disproportionate, outsized fear.
Right. Which I have experience with. Yeah. The disproportionate not mattering, fear of not mattering.
Yeah. We're not, I hope it's obvious we're not advocating for getting rid of all fear. I just said it. We need fear to live and learn. Fear's fine. It's the unnecessarily warping fear that causes us to do injurious stuff. That's the stuff I want to get out.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Are we advocating for never lying?
Are we advocating for never lying? Well, I'm going to remind you, you get to advocate on your own voice.
Are you?
Am I advocating for never lying?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I guess I wasn't planning to say that. Although we are going to talk about sort of a related thing here shortly about harm and damage as a construct, not just as a reality.
Okay, well, maybe that will answer my question.
Maybe. I've already said it in the show that it continues to be my sense that I'm invited toward more honesty, increased honesty, practicing of honesty, which has definitely included less and less lying. Another note here is that in my experience, it's not that the motive or that what I'm now calling defective way of being, like being vain, it's not that that doesn't matter, but in my practical lived experience, it seems like the action is the part that actually counts. Theoretically, I can be vain, but then not do any behavior consistent with being vain. And it's like, then that's okay. Same with fear. I can have fear arise. Let's even say cleanly irrational fear arise. And then if I don't take any action consistent with that fear, it's not a problem that I had the fear. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, as you kind of started to get to already when you asked about never lying, and I said, well, we're kind of going to talk about that with this thing about harm. So all of this talk at this point, it really does assume that we are agreeing that there is such a thing as harm or injury or damage. These are synonymous for me. Technically, I'm pretty sure harm means damage, whether that's physical or spiritual or emotional or whatever. It assumes that we agree that there is such a thing as harm and that we are interested in not causing harm. And those aren't a given. Not everyone is on board with that there is such a thing as harm or that we are interested in not causing harm. I'll concede that this area is complicated, that it has been complicated for me to walk through and process. I'm going to just kind of readily acknowledge that I really was in the camp that harm was kind of conceptual and not useful. I don't really still feel like I have good words to talk about it with, but it was very hard for me to identify harm. And I think that part of this is that yes, of course, there's tangible harm or more tangible harm. And then there's harm that is a little bit more of a construct that we agree that something is harmful. And so then that's what we consider damaging. There's harm. There was an example you and I talked about yesterday. Oh, yeah, we're going to share an anecdote later in the show, an example of when someone lied to me, and I was unaware that they had lied. It was undetectable to me. It seemed like, well, did that damage me? It was undetectable. And that makes it hard to, see, well, does that mean that it was harmful then? And we'll talk about it again later there, but the person who lied to me, he experienced that it had damaged him. And that counts as harm. So sometimes in examining whether a behavior is injurious, what works is to really zoom out, not be too close in on where we assume the damage might be. But also this is part of why the work for identifying harm that we've committed usually happens earlier in the steps in 4 rather than in 6 and 7 here, or 8 and 9, where we look more at damage and harm. But I just want to acknowledge that this can be a very common spot to have confusion and difficulty in identifying what is harmful and what isn't.
I think that's a really good example, though. I think when you frame it as, like, for instance, when I lie, it's a good guess. It's likely if it's that it won't harm the other person, and like I mean, sometimes I'm sure, but
Well, depends on the lie.
depends
for
on the
sure.
lie. But
Yeah.
I'm talking about lies. I think we could all understand, like, wouldn't necessarily harm a person if they didn't had no knowledge of it. For instance, like your example is good, which was
Well, let's
talk about it.
Talk about it now. So, an acquaintance who I had gotten to know through a school class, very casually, only interacted in class. We had shared teeny tiny little bits about ourselves over the quarter, and then agreed to have lunch after the quarter. And before we sat down to lunch, he said, before we have lunch, I really want to tell you, I've told you a couple of lies. I had said something about my girlfriend, and the truth is I didn't have a girlfriend. I'd like to have a girlfriend. And so I had said I had a girlfriend. And then I had also said that I'd gotten into this university that I applied to, and I hadn't gotten into it yet. I had applied, but I, wanted to sound cool and good and interesting. And so I said I'd already gotten in. And my reflex when he said, and I didn't want that to be between us, even while we have lunch. And we did not have an ongoing friendship. I don't think I've ever even seen that person again. This was years ago. But for him, it mattered enough to clear this up, even so that we could have a productive lunch. And for me, I was just totally endeared to him. I could so relate to telling lies like that and to wanting people to think well of me. And that I loved that he had the interest in correcting that. It seemed so generous and sweet. And it just had the effect of endearing me to him more. Now that we're talking about this harm thing, though, I can see something I don't think I've seen before about this. He did sway my view of him when he lied. I came to think of him as safer, maybe. I'm not really saying that I saw him as safer because he told me he had a girlfriend, but I can imagine that might have that effect. Mm-hmm. Same with getting into school. These are credibility building lies that it turns out he didn't actually qualify for. And there are occasions where that is damaging, to promote an image that we don't actually have, to shape how somebody relates to us. So even until I'm telling this story today, I hadn't really acknowledged again, it seems so extreme to call it harm, but those lies did affect me and how I interacted with him in a way that wasn't accurate. And I'm not that in the scale of like good for me or bad for me. I'm going to say that's not good for me. I'm not saying it's like the worst thing ever. It's not assault, but it's not good.
Right. In that case, I think I was going to try to talk more about how, he had noticed, or you had noticed that he probably had noticed that he had harmed himself in doing that because, he had to live with the fact that he was doing that. But I think that, a part of the harm is maybe like an unconscious, but still, some level of awareness that you're misinforming someone's perception of you. And that's going to influence them, and to some degree. And yeah.
So that makes me wonder if not that we're wrong about saying that harm is conceptual, that there's conceptual harm, but in this example, I think I was thinking of this harm as created. And now that we're talking about it this way, it doesn't seem that way. It seems like it's tangible.
Well, I think this is just further evidence that, lying is complicated and that damage and the construct of damage is complex, and it's worth
continuing to talk through. Yeah, well, we've said it in the show before. We are not here because we see that we have all the answers. And but maybe I feel like this is an occasion more than in the past on the show where I am seeing new things as we talk. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's happened in the show before, but this feels like, oh, wait a minute, really, this picture isn't very full even for me.
Yeah, I think in the past when I have lied and I have been moved to like admit that lie to that person, part of the reason was not so much that it was hard to live with the lie, but because I knew that I was shaping perhaps, in a false way someone else's, a little bit of their life, a little bit of, their perception and their action, and not allowing someone to be fully informed, or maybe not fully informed, but not allowing someone to be accurately informed.
Yeah.
With the information I was giving them about myself. And that instinctually feels wrong.
Good.
Yeah.
I think we talked about it a few days ago, that's in essence, it's dehumanizing to take that access to a full picture for people to be able to be self-determining and proceed in light of an accurate picture. It's dangerous. I can also hear as we talk that this is a lot of the work of 6, which typically we would spend, dealing with ourselves about if we're actually interested in letting go of doing things like lying. And maybe it's good to point out that this is, I've been doing 6 and 7 work for 20 odd years, and they're still connected to each other. That even though, yes, I guess I have it that I am not for lying, that continuing to reconcile how damaging lying is still like an ongoing thing. There's something really critical that I want to share here about harm, about damage. And this comes up pretty often, just in us chatting. It came up the other day where we're in a community where seeing the positive, seeing the bright side, appreciating whatever there is to appreciate about a scenario is very important. It's important to be able to carry on and proceed through difficult things. It's a good and useful tool. And there's a risk with it. The risk being that somehow the bad stuff, the harm, the damage that maybe precipitated some lesson, some fruitful spiritual lesson or life lesson, that we slide into justifying or excusing the damage that led to the lesson. So I think of this as manure and fruit. So, and I didn't even say this earlier, but I am of the mind that it really works to take the position that when I make decisions based on self, so for me, I don't mean like my higher, beautiful, divinely connected self. I mean lower, reflexive, problematic, warped self. When I make decisions that aren't from inspiration, going back to our very first episodes about God. So if I, when I'm doing stuff, by and large, if I'm doing stuff operating from something other than inspiration, that those things accumulate debris. They cause debris to accumulate. For me, damage and the accumulation of debris, it's same. I guess I can think of it like scar tissue. So that's actually the position I take in my life, is that when I make a decision that's not from inspiration, that debris accumulates, harm, damage. So that's what I do. I walk around in life, even a person like me who's really steadfastly attempting to practice a third step where I surrender how I live to what I trust to guide me, being my conscience. I still make mountains of decisions and choices out of reflex or urge or whatever. And so debris accumulates. And I would call that manure in this story. The miracle, or for me, maybe even what God is that somehow I keep making shit and there keeps being fruit. It is totally real to me that I look around and I see lots and lots of beautiful fruit. Everywhere in my personal life and in the world, there's lots of fruit. I mean, yes, there's lots of shit too, but there's a lot of fruit. There's way more fruit than I've ever made. And for me, that's God. Now, the reason I like to talk about it like this is that I think it's really dangerous to start acting like it's okay for me to make shit because that's how fruit gets made. For me, that is big like alarm bells time. if I start to excuse or pardon or justify my selfish behavior because I know that fruit is going to come out of it, no, I'm way on the wrong track. I'm going to volunteer that is a newer development in my spiritual life. I'm going to say maybe 6-ish years ago, maybe 6, 7-ish years ago, I caused some harm that had a profound effect on me and showed me a lot of how much justification I had been doing. That I'm very grateful for those shifts and changes. And maybe I'll share more about that at some point, but not for today. For today, really what I want to say is I think it's real dangerous and risky, at least for me, to justify my shit because I know good fruit's going to come out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a balance. I think you need to, in order to have the agency to shift, be aware of fruit, right? So it doesn't like lock you in a paralysis of morbid self-reflection. But at the same time, take that responsibility and that awareness that there's something innately wrong with
causing damage.
Living as if the shit that we are creating is okay or good because it creates fruit. And I know that when I create shit or I'm seeing I'm about to, one of my thought processes is can be around sort of that justification, that cognitive process of like justifying.
But this good is also going to come out of it.
But something good will come out of this, or like not even so consciously, but just like that sort of that awareness that like, it won't, it'll. Time will heal it, or it will be, it will be okay eventually, or, and I think that sort of that thought is out of the awareness that like fruit gets made and the awareness of God. But never has it felt right to like live from that place and act from that place. Whenever I do, it's only because I think I'm too like emotionally or like spiritually lazy or unwilling to act from a better place.
That's really insightful. Thank you. I also hear that doing that kind of justifying, it certainly doesn't support us living without injurious behaviors. It appears to support us in continuing with injurious behaviors, which is the whole point of this step. Well, step 7. So I don't think I've said, and I didn't intend to frame this episode specifically on 6 or 7. I thought it would be useful to talk generally about injurious behaviors before we actually really dug in on practicing anything around them. But our Citizen 12 Step 7 is do what it takes to live without injurious behaviors. So for me, in that aim, it's going to include unraveling the weird stories I tell myself about that God's going to make fruit out of my shit. Even though, yes, we see that does happen, it doesn't support me in living without injurious behaviors. So it helps for it to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like saying, this is an extreme example, but, I think because like there's a naturally destructive force in nature, we can sort of like use that as justification. And, when we see, the world turns another day, even though like awful things happen. And I think that we do that, honestly, I think the reason we go to that justification process is only because we're trying to find enough softness in ourselves to like live with ourselves, and I think that that's available while being responsible. I mean, like for me, for Paige, it's like finding enough like self-love despite having made a mistake, like lying, while being responsible for it is available without having to like justify and to, justify that making mistakes is something that you can be okay continuing to do.
I can hear that there's going to be a lot more to unpack here. I actually, again, will report that my spiritual sense now is not that it's okay for me to keep making mistakes. kind of not what you were just saying.
No, that is what I was
Oh,
just
it is?
saying.
Oh, okay. I feel like I'm kind of under guidance to not cause any harm. Period. Yes, also trusting I'm going to keep making mistakes. I mean, I know how life works well enough to know that like if I'm alive, I'm going to keep doing stuff that causes damage. And yes, making space to do whatever we need to do to be responsible for the mistakes we do make, great. I guess I have two kind of buckets, that there are mistakes that we've already made, and then it's really useful to keep separate the mistakes that we haven't already made yet. And to really be responsible for that. I'm gonna be a person who isn't causing damage. And even the word mistake is tricky, right? Theoretically, being late once is a mistake. Ever being late again is something we had enough information to head off. Not really a mistake. That is now some other thing. It's complicated, hard stuff. So rather than continue to try to unpack, I actually hear that even we've already recorded so long today that I think we should actually conclude this episode on injurious behaviors here and come back next time to talk about lying.
I'm all for that.
As we always say, we will, and as I just said, we will undoubtedly come back to these topics again, but that's all for now. Thank you for joining us. This show isn't a thing without you. Please find us online, chime in, write to us. We're listening for how best to serve. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, all at C12Pod. That's C12Pod. We are also on Patreon, where our listeners have early access to our shows. Patreon supporters at any contribution level can listen to new episodes on Monday mornings, and our non-Patreon listeners don't have access to our shows until Friday mornings. We can be found through patreon.com/C12pod. It looks to us as though our community could really use this content, and we are excited to create and share it. This is a 100% listener-supported show, so please, if you do like what you're hearing, or even if you don't like it, but you think what we're up to is good, consider contributing. And support us by subscribing, rating the show, and writing us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you to each of you who contribute to this work.
Thank you. Thank you.